Well, if you've ever been afraid, and according to our guest today, Pete Wilson, that pretty much encompasses every one of us, then you're going to want to stay tuned for the next 10 minutes as we talk about his most recent book, What Keeps You Up at Night. Thank you so much for coming.
Oh, it's an honor. Glad to be here.
I loved your book, and I'm not just saying that because we're here. And I really loved it. It was really, really good. You know, and fear is such a great topic because you say, as I said in my introduction, every single one of us is afraid. So how come some people don't look afraid?
You know, that's great. That's a great question, because I think that a lot of times we look at certain people and we think, well, they seem to have it all together. Like they're parenting and they're not afraid, or you know, they're trying new things. And I think for the most part that's not true. I think some people are really good at hiding their fear. And I thought about this. It was interesting. The other day I was talking about this whole topic of fear, and while I was talking, it just popped in my head that I tend to feel the most fear in my life when I'm driving. Like just the fear thoughts of, Pete, do you really know how to lead a church? Or do you really know how to write books? Or you? And then I started just kind of asking God, why is that I feel fear the most when I'm driving my car? And what I felt like God was kind of prompting me with was, well, that's when you're alone. And I thought, you know what? In almost every area of my life, I'm surrounded by people where I feel like I have to look like I'm courageous and look like I know how I have it all together. But when I'm in my car and I'm by myself, all those illusions go away, and I realize just how broken, how ill-equipped I am to do the things that I feel like God's called me to do in my life. And that's when I really struggle with fear.
And you know what? There's such a freedom for you to say that, because I think everybody watching just took a big breath and a big sigh and went, you know what? He's doing really good with his life and he's still afraid. So maybe I'm okay.
Yeah, fear is something I struggle with every day. And whether it's, in leading a church or whether it's in parenting or in my marriage, I think fear, for a lot of us, I think that a lot of people think that over time, if you grow spiritually, that over time, the more spiritually mature you are, the more you won't have fear. The more spiritually mature you are, the more clarity you'll have. But I think the reality is the more spiritually mature you are, the less clarity you need.
And probably in all of our lives, there are things we're being held back from by fear. But some people really can accomplish even though they're afraid. So what is that difference? What makes the difference that you can be afraid and yet still not be controlled by fear?
Yeah, and I think that's the key, is we're all going to experience fear. The question is your fear paralyzing you? Is your fear controlling you? And so what I believe that our goal is as believers is that you allow the fear to be the fuel that pushes you into a deeper relationship with Christ. Not something that keeps you away from Him or has you running in the opposite direction like it does for a lot of people. So anytime I start to feel fear now, for me that's a prompt. It's just this prompt of, okay, like, you know what, you don't hold this whole thing together. And I think that's a lie a lot of people have bought into of, ooh, I got to hold this whole thing called my life together. And if I don't, this won't happen or that won't happen. And the reality is we don't hold it all together. And the quicker you can really understand that you don't have control, you've really never had control, you need to lean into the only one who's ever had control, which is God Himself, the better off we all are.
We could spend the rest of the time just talking about that concept alone, I think, right? Because most of us, we feel safe when we feel like we have all of our ducks in a row. I think that's so true. Well, the thing about fear too is, like, I grew up in a faith tradition where it was like, if you just follow God, everything good will always happen to you. Like your life will just be like butterflies and unicorns. And unfortunately, I've lived long enough to realize that that's not always true.
Right.
So what happens when you're facing your fear, you're pursuing those dreams, you're walking hand in hand with God, and then it doesn't turn out well, or it doesn't turn out the way that you hoped? It's a failure, is what we would consider.
Yeah, that's a great point. I think, again, in the book, what I talk about is this idea that the goal isn't to not have fear. Jesus never promises that we won't fear. He just promises that He will be with us in the midst of the fear. And we see that all throughout the Bible. In the Old Testament, there's a character by the name of Joseph, who, his story is really interesting to me because it starts with he has this God-given dream, but then everything in his life circumstantially falls apart.
Yeah, it really falls apart. That's like understating it.
Exactly. The whole thing,
awful.
He goes from favored son to he's beat up by his brothers and sold into slavery. He's falsely accused of rape. He's thrown in prison. He's forgotten about in prison. And yet, I think it's 6 different times in his story we read this phrase, and the Lord was with Joseph. We read it while he was a slave. We read about it while he was forgotten about in prison. And I kind of grew up in a similar faith tradition as well. And so I remember reading that story and thinking, the Lord was with Joseph? I don't think so. He just got beat up by his brothers. You know, he was sold as a slave. He was forgotten about in prison. And I think for a lot of us, that doesn't match up because we think that if we're obedient to God, that means everything is going to work out the way we want it to work out. And that's just not reality. And so the promise is, again, not that there won't be storms in life. The promise is that Jesus will be with you in the midst of that storm. And you can lean into him and you can trust him when everything feels like it's falling apart.
And part of that trust is that we know that God's has the bigger picture. Like there's a story here that you're a part of that you don't see necessarily when you're going through that storm. And I love what you said, you're part of a bigger story, but you're not the central character, God is. That's really stuck with me because, I mean, you know, we don't feel self-absorbed, but in a way, right? Our story's about us.
Wait, you're kidding me? I'm not the star of this movie called Life? Yeah, and I think that's helpful to understand that our lives exist really to ultimately give God glory. And we can do that in the up times and the down times. We just have to learn to trust him with every detail of it.
So when everything goes wrong with our dreams or there's a failure or a storm, as you said, like how do we still trust God then? Like, what do we grab onto about that? Is it the bigger story? Is that we think that, we say sometimes the enemy meant it for evil, but God's going to bring good out of it? Is that?
Yeah. Well, I think for me, I have to go back to God's character. Go back to his faithfulness. I try to look back in my life at so many moments where I felt panicked and I felt like the whole thing was going to fall apart, and yet God's been there for me again and again and again. It's kind of the whole story of the Israelites in the Old Testament. Mm-hmm. They just cannot remember God's faithfulness. And so every time they got hungry or there wasn't water or they got lost, they panicked. And we're reading through that story and we're like, How could they? He just saved them from 400 years of slavery. Yes. And yet we do the exact same thing in our life. And so, I have 3 boys and we have a bunch of dogs. And we have 2 dogs that run off all the time. And every time they run off, sometimes they're gone for 4 hours. They've been gone for as long as 2 days before. And my boys just panic. They're like, they're gone forever. They're not coming back. And I'll say, boys, is there anything about these dogs' history that would lead you to believe that they're not going to come back? They come back every time. And so every once in a while I have to say to myself, hey, Pete, is there anything in your past history that leads you to believe that God's not in control of your life? And then I'm like, okay, I've been here before. I've been in a similar situation where I felt panicked and I felt fear and anxiety and worry and I didn't know what was going to happen. I've been there so many times, and every single time, not that it worked out exactly the way I wanted it to work out, but I can point back at all of those different moments in my life and I can see God's hand at work. I can see his larger plan beginning to unfold, and it's just that reminder that I can trust him.
Yeah, and sometimes it's not only about not getting the answer, sometimes it's about the timing of the answer, right? So you call us quickaholics, which I had to read that and go, I think that might describe me.
Yeah.
Or most of us, right? We want everything instantly. And sometimes it's about God's doing something through the waiting, through the delay of the dream. There's something he's doing in you about faith and trust and character.
Yeah, we want things fast. A lot of times what happens for us is we're at step 1 and we want to not take the next step until we see the last step. Mm-hmm. And so we get so focused on trying to figure out the ending of our story that a lot of us never get around to the beginning. Mm-hmm. And the reality is you're not going to know the last step before you take the first step. That's why it's called faith.
I know. I want to say to God, okay, I'll do this as long as I know it's going to work out well.
Exactly.
Right? As long as I know I'm a success.
I'm embarrassed at how many times I've prayed that prayer over and over and over again. And it's like every time God's kind of like, well, will you just trust me in this? Will you trust me? Will you do the next right thing? Take that next right step.
I like that. When you're in confusion and you don't know what to do and you don't know the ending and you're afraid, just do the next right thing that you know is the right thing to do. That is so smart. Well, the last thing I just want to hit before we finish here is clarity. I always was taught to pray for clarity when I'm confused or unsure or scared. And you said maybe that's not the right thing to do. Why?
Well, again, I think there's a very specific reason. We want clarity. We want to see, if there's 10 steps, we want to see 1 through 10. We want to see every one of them. I think the reality is God knows that if He were to show us every single step, we'd end up worshiping the steps instead of Him.
Or jumping ahead. I like to skip a few myself.
Absolutely.
Just get to the end.
And so when I'm just taking the next right step, we talk about this in the book, that what happens is it creates this dependency on God. And I would like to think that I would be dependent on Him even if I knew every step. But the reality is I probably would not. And so living this life of faith, this adventure that He's called all of us to, that requires us to take a step before we know exactly how it's going to end, in the long run teaches us to really trust Him and to lean into Him and to get to know this good God in new and in fresh ways.
Well, this is so important for us to talk about, and I could talk to you for the next hour about this because this is the life stuff that we're all facing. Thank you for being honest about all of this. I think it's very freeing. We'd love to have you back, and of course, I'm sure we will for your next book.
Thank you. I hope it's been helpful.
It's been awesome. And if you've been watching this and this is speaking to you, we have prayer lines 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, some of the nicest, warmest, most wonderful people you've ever talked to who just want to pray with you. Even some of the fears maybe that have come up as you've been listening today, fear of being a good dad, fear for your career, for different things in your life that you're facing. We want to pray with you. Give us a call.